There have been several issues where we've seen a confusion on the issue of separation of church and state, which apparently is somewhere in the Constitution. We haven't been, some brick wall keep talking about this all the time, which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, does not exist. But it does get inculcated at various times into legislation. And one of those issues has to do with education. And we have joining us this afternoon someone who, quite frankly, and by the way, I'm just thinking right now, I may not be able to get this person online because they may be locked in. So I'm going to try to put them on hold and hope that let me just do it this way. There we go. I've got him on hold, and now I'm going to be able to get him online. Okay, we lost him. We're going to try to get Mark Meckler on as I prepare to get this program going again. We're hoping to talk with Mark Meckler. He's president of the nonprofit group Convention of States Action, and he is expressing some support for a decision by Betsy DeVos. She is, of course, the Secretary of Department of Education on the topic of providing services to schools through religious organizations. And with that, we do have our guest, Mark Meckler, back on. Mark, my apologies. I think I pushed the wrong button when I was talking with you a few moments ago off air. But thank you. Welcome to the program, by the way. Mark.
So I think this is really interesting. And I think what we're seeing out of this administration is the most religiously friendly administration in modern history. It's an extraordinary thing to say, knowing Donald Trump's history, but he did appoint Betsy DeVos, a very religious woman who also has a very open view of what our education system would be. She's done some incredible things, and this most recent thing is she's no longer going to interpret a federal law as prohibiting religious organizations from partnering with private schools to provide what they call equitable services. Now, that's a mouthful. It's a lawyer thing, but equitable services are things like tutoring, mentoring, like simple stuff, professional development stuff. They have nothing to do with religion. And the way the federal law had been interpreted is that if somebody was religious, they weren't allowed to provide those services. Outrageous, straight-up bigotry against religious people.
You know, this is also a waste of talent in the process. And we have various organizations that have talented people that could provide services for educational systems. What's interesting, and I want to chat briefly about this as well, we're going to get into a few moments, is how the country has seen religion in our day-to-day life. But back to your comment, this is an issue that I'm wondering might generate some illegal reaction. Is there a possibility of that?
You know, I think that it is possible that people will object to this and react legally. But what's important to note, and unfortunately it's strange, a lot of government gets done this way. The law as written in 1965, what's called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, did not require the discrimination against religious groups.
Right.
That was simply an quote-unquote interpretation. So the law has now been reinterpreted. Folks, the government interprets things one way or another, up to depending on the changing times. I don't really like that. This is what they do. So it's going to be very hard to challenge this decision legally.
All right. We're talking with Mark Meckler. And again, he is he's the president of the Convention of States Action. We're going to chat about that in a few moments ago. This goes back to an issue of 2017 Supreme Court decision, Trinity Lutheran Church of Columbia versus Comer, in which the state of Missouri was found to have unconstitutionally discriminated against a church-run private preschool. Is that right?
Yeah, so there, in that case, and I think this is important, this is where this flows from. In that case, there were grants being given out to schools to rehab their playgrounds and make them more safe. And it was decided that the government was not allowed to give a grant to a religious preschool, simply on the basis of the religion. In other words, direct, again, and I'm just going to use this word because I think it's important, direct anti-religious bigotry in the name of government. In other words, the only reason for discriminating against them is because they were a religious institution. And certainly nowhere in the Constitution does it say that government should be hostile to religion.
But we've seen it over and over again, and we've seen it in other instances with a variety of other organizations. I've talked with representatives, I think it's Liberty First, related to the issue of religious organizations placing banners on football field or baseball fields on the backfield fence, and they've been stopped from doing that. They're not allowed. They're actually contributing to the program. They're giving money, but they're not allowed to place their message because it, quote, comes from a religious organization. This, real quickly, Mark, and again, Mark Meckler with an organization called Convention of States Action, and we're going to get into details of that organization here in just a moment. This reaction to Betsy DeVos, and you mentioned also the president, and in many regards, yes, the president is perceived as being very secular, yes, rough around the edges to say the least, but the real kicker here is he's not a politician. He's not looking for political gain. And this, unfortunately, religion and the relationship between religion and public entities, that is schools and other facilities, have become really a kind of a rallying point for politics, not for common sense.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And if we go back to the founding of the country, it's important to note that the founders were deeply engaged in the practice of religion, as were governments. And most people don't realize many of the state governments at the beginning of the country actually paid ministers. Pastors and ministers were on state salaries. There are actually laws on the books in many of the original states requiring people to attend church. So the idea that the founders were not religious people or didn't intend for government to be involved in religion in any way is simply a falsehood. What they intended, and in this discussion about church and separation of church and state, which comes long after the Constitution, it's in a Jefferson letter, what he was talking about is keeping the government out of the business religion of the churches.
Right. You know, this goes back to the issue, and of course we'll touch on this. And I'm definitely not a constitutional authority on this, but the First Amendment, which sadly we heard recently as a result of some polling, many in this country really don't know the details of the First Amendment. And of course, they see the First Amendment as freedom of speech. They totally ignore the issue of petition, and of course, I've talked to someone. The freedom of religion. Not, from religion, but of religion. The fact that government shall not interfere versus that religion can't engage in government. It's that government cannot engage in religion, cannot interfere in religion. And that's one of the frustrations I have when I talk to folks with, various schools, how they cringe every time the topic of religion comes up.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I'll tell you, I have plenty of friends who are not religious, they're not practicing Christians or people of any faith, who recognize the necessity of strong faith in a healthy society. Right. And that's what we're talking about. Look, this country was founded on a moral and religious basis. The founders even said our Constitution is made for a moral and religious people as wholly inadequate for any other. So that's the basis for the Republic. We need to make sure that we preserve those ideals, or we will lose the Republic.
All right. I think this is an important story. And, of course, we're chatting with Mark Meckler. And, Mark, this allows me to segue over into the issue of one of the topics we've discussed in the past. You've been on the air with me in the past. President of the Convention of States Action. Let's talk about that, maybe in process of this as well. You're trying to put together a constitutional convention. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, it's actually called a Convention of States, not a constitutional convention. The language is a little bit different because it takes place under Article 5 of the United States Constitution. It specifically gives you and me and all the people of the country the power, acting through our state legislatures, to call a convention. And in that convention, we have the power to suggest amendments to the Constitution. Important to understand, the convention can do nothing, actually, other than make suggestions. If suggestions come out of convention, then they go to 38 states for ratification. So this particular convention application that we're pursuing right now, we're pursuing it all over the country, including there in North Carolina. It's been passed in 14 states. Mississippi will be 15 this week.
Really?
It calls for three things. It calls for imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, like a balanced budget amendment. It calls for imposing term limits on Congress and federal officials, including bureaucrats and staffers. And it also calls for scope and jurisdictional limits on the federal government. And, yeah, Mississippi, I expect literally any minute, probably tomorrow, will pass the House of Mississippi, and that'll make Mississippi number 15. Arkansas was number 13, and Utah was number 14 in the last month or so.
Well, let's talk about the Convention of States. Now, when you say they passed this, what's the procedure?
So the way it works is every state is taking up the same resolution. And when a legislature in a state takes up a resolution, it doesn't require a governor's signature like a law or a bill. It's just a resolution. And so that means it has to pass the majority of both houses. And so you've got to get through both houses, generally in the same session in any given legislature. North Carolina was just introduced as HJR 590, and that'll be proceeding. I was in North Carolina a couple of weeks ago. I'll actually be back there in the legislature in Raleigh on the 10th of April, and I think I'm also doing a public appearance in Greensboro on the 11th of April.
All right. Once the legislatures pass, if they pass the resolution, then what happens? First off, does it require a magic number of states to have this convention? Can you have it with just 13? What's the number?
The number specified in the Constitution is 2/3. So today, that's 34 states are required to call the convention. So here, we're just about to hit 15. We're almost halfway there. Once you get to 34, Congress has a job. It actually says in the Constitution, once the required numbers hit, Congress calls the convention, means they name the time and place. They'll do that. The states will each send a delegation made up of what are called commissioners. Mm-hmm. Those commissioners carry with them their papers or their commissions, which gives them the authority to do that which the states approve of, basically what they called the convention for, the three things I discussed. The commissioners will get into convention. They will debate and discuss possible amendments. If 26 states can agree on a slate of amendments or one amendment, they will send those out to the states for ratification, and then it takes 3/4 of the states, 38 states, to ratify any amendment before it becomes part of the Constitution.
All right. The last Constitutional Convention was what, 1785?
1787.
87. Okay. And so, oh, wow, we're going on 230, 240 years since we've had a Constitutional Convention. Let's talk about this in relationship to publicity on the of your efforts. And again, we're chatting with Mark Meckler, Convention of the States Action, and we're going to get the the website here in a moment. How are you promoting this? How is being developed across the country?
Well, so we've been doing this for 5 years, and when it first started, it was kind of a sleepy little effort. That's we figured we would start slowly. But God blessed us. Mark Levin wrote the book, The Liberty Amendments, which literally, providentially, was about the same subject at the same time we were launching the project. And so when that book came out, everybody started looking for Convention of States online, and they found us. So having Levin essentially as the first endorser was absolutely huge. That Governor Huckabee got on board, and since people like Sean Hannity and most recently Ben Shapiro have joined on the bandwagon and are big supporters, we've got a lot of senators that are in support. So a lot of our support comes from people who are very well known talking about it. It also comes from doing interviews like this with you. People hear about it for the first time. And then the biggest way is just one person talking to another face-to-face or online. We've got 1.5 million Facebook followers. We have now 3.8 million people that have signed on to be part of the project.
All right, Mark Meckler again with this Convention of the States Action. Let's talk about this. The three items of concern here: balanced budget, and believe me, I think there are a lot of people very interested in that. Term limits, I think that has a lot of momentum as well. Scope of federal jurisdiction, that's a big issue for especially folks of a conservative nature. What are the chances of actually holding this convention and a few other items being added to it, such as expansion of the Supreme Court, for example, things of that nature? What is the future of that?
Yeah, so the way that the applications are structured, and this is very important, these were created by the leading conservative constitutional attorneys in the nation to make sure that we couldn't go beyond the scope of what was being proposed. And so these are things that limit all of them, the scope, the jurisdiction, the power, the reach of the federal government. Anything that would expand the power of the federal government is not available under this, or anything that would just fall in some other random category. For example, the expansion of the Supreme Court in no way limits the power of the federal government. And by the way, that can be done legislatively, so that would have nothing
to do with,
too.
Yes, he could.
Nothing to do with the convention. Another one that I hear discussed all the time is the elimination of the Electoral College.
Right.
Absolutely, I'm completely opposed to that. That's an outrageous, obnoxious idea that's antithetical to our republic. It can't be done under this because it does not in any way limit the scope, the power, or the jurisdiction of the federal government. It can't even be discussed. So what would happen if somebody were to bring that up in convention? Any other delegate, in particular a delegate from a conservative state, would raise their hand, raise a point of order, say that's not within our mandate, it's not what's called germane, and that would be immediately gavelled down, and it couldn't even be discussed at convention.
All right. Let's talk about one other quick item before we break it up with you. Those who are most interested in this, I'm wondering, this seems to have a little bit of a youth appointment to it, if you will. I would think that millennials and younger voters would be interested in what you're proposing.
Yeah, it's interesting. It started with older people like me, and probably because it was started by older folks like me. But what we're seeing now is an explosion in the youth movement. Charlie Kirk, who runs Turning Point USA, right, the largest millennial organization in the country, is an endorser and supporter of ours. We work a lot with Turning Point. Most recently, Ben Shapiro came on board. Just over the last few weeks, we have over 40,000 new folks that have joined the organization through the Ben Shapiro Show. So it has a lot of currency with young people. And here's why. They look at the system, they know it's broken. They say to their parents, you guys have been voting forever to put in good people. It's still broken.
Right.
We have to do something else. And so they're looking for something different, something new, something that is structural, and they found Convention of States, and they're calling it home.
I think the issue particularly of particular concern, and this should resonate with all of our audience, no matter what your political background or bias is, term limits and the balanced budget. And, of course, balanced budget, very big issue in relationship to the young voters because they're the ones saddled with the $22 trillion and growing national debt. Our guest this afternoon, Mark Meckler. And, Mark, the website for finding out more information?
Yeah, the website is conventionofstates.com. It's really important that you go there and check this out. Here's why. Because we can talk about this on the radio all we want. You and I can run around and shout about it. But it's up to regular people to save the country. They're the only people who ever have. And you can get involved at conventionofstates.com. Conventionofstates.com.
And our guest, and by the way, president of the organization, Convention of States Action, Mark Meckler, with us this afternoon. Mark, you've got 14 states. Now, what are the other states that are sort of in the wings, ready to sign this petition?
Well, I think Mississippi's going to pop here in the next couple of days, definitely before the end of the week. They'll be number 15. And then sort of next up, really, for me, for focus on my agenda, are North Carolina and South Carolina.
Okay, and Mark's going to be in our state here the next couple of weeks. Mark, stay with me. I'll chat with you briefly off air. I do appreciate your time this afternoon. Mark Meckler with us, Convention of States Action. Joining us in just a moment, an interview I did earlier today with Brian Balfour of the Civitas Institute on the topic of expansion of Medicaid in North Carolina. Stay with us for more here on Viewpoints on the Talk Station.